In the middle of this month is the festival of El Bougat, that is, of the weeping women, and this is the Taus festival, which is celebrated in honour of the god Taus. The women bewail him because his lord slew him so cruelly, ground his bones in a mill, and then scattered them to the wind. The women during this festival eat nothing which has been ground in a mill, but limit their diet to steeped wheat, sweet vetches, dates, raisins, and the like. Taus, who is no other than Tammuz, is here like Burns's John Barleycorn. They wasted o'er a scorching flame the marrow of his bones, but a miller used him worst of all, for he crushed him between two stones. This concentration, so to say, of the nature of Adonis upon the cereal crops is characteristic of the state of culture reached by his worshippers in historical times. They had left the nomadic life of the wandering hunter and herdsman far behind them. For ages they had been settled on the land, and had depended for their subsistence mainly on the products of tillage. The berries and roots of the wilderness, the grass of the pastures, which had been matters of vital importance to their ruder forefathers, were now of little moment to them. More and more their thoughts and energies were engrossed by the staple of their life, the corn. More and more, accordingly, the propitiation of the deities of fertility in general, and of the corn spirit in particular, tended to become the central feature of their religion. The aim they set before themselves in celebrating the rites was thoroughly practical. It was no vague poetical sentiment which prompted them to hail with joy the rebirth of vegetation, and to mourn its decline. Hunger, felt or feared, was the mainspring of the worship of Adonis. It has been suggested by Father Lagrange that the mourning for Adonis was essentially a harvest rite designed to propitiate the corn god, who was then either perishing under the sickles of the reapers, or being trodden to death under the hoofs of the oxen on the threshing floor. While the men slew him, the women wept crocodile tears at home to appease his natural indignation by a show of grief for his death. The theory fits in well with the dates of the festivals, which fell in spring or summer; for spring and summer, not autumn, are the seasons of the barley and wheat harvests in the lands which worshipped Adonis. Further, the hypothesis is confirmed by the practice of the Egyptian reapers, who lamented, calling upon Isis, when they cut the first corn; and it is recommended by the analogous customs of many hunting tribes, who testify great respect for the animals which they kill and eat. Thus interpreted, the death of Adonis is not the natural decay of vegetation in general under the summer heat or the winter cold. It is the violent destruction of the corn by man, who cuts it down on the field, stamps it to pieces on the threshing floor, and grinds it to powder in the mill. That this was indeed the principal aspect in which Adonis presented himself in later times to the agricultural people of the Levant may be admitted, but whether from the beginning he had been the corn and nothing but the corn may be doubted. At an earlier period he may have been to the herdsman, above all, the tender herbage which sprouts after rain, offering rich pasture to the lean and hungry cattle. Earlier still he may have embodied the spirit of the nuts and berries which the autumn woods yield to the savage hunter and his squaw. And just as the husbandman must propitiate the spirit of the corn which he consumes, so the herdsman must appease the spirit of the grass and leaves which his cattle munch, and the hunter must soothe the spirit of the roots which he digs, and of the fruits which he gathers from the bough. In all cases the propitiation of the injured and angry sprite would naturally comprise elaborate excuses and apologies, accompanied by loud lamentations at his decease, whenever, through some deplorable accident or necessity, he happened to be murdered as well as robbed. Only we must bear in mind that the savage hunter and herdsman of those early days had probably not yet attained to the abstract idea of vegetation in general, and that accordingly, so far as Adonis existed for them at all, he must have been the Adon or lord of each individual tree and plant, rather than a personification of vegetable life as a whole. Thus there would be as many Adonises as there were trees and shrubs, and each of them might expect to receive satisfaction for any damage done to his person or property. And year by year, when the trees were deciduous, every Adonis would seem to bleed to death with the red leaves of autumn, and to come to life again with the fresh green of spring. There is some reason to think that in early times Adonis was sometimes personated by a living man, who died a violent death in the character of the god. Further, there is evidence which goes to show that among the agricultural peoples of the eastern Mediterranean the corn spirit, by whatever name he was known, was often represented year by human victims slain on the harvest field. If that were so, it seems likely that the propitiation of the corn spirit would tend to fuse to some extent with the worship of the dead. For the spirits of these victims might be thought to return to life in the ears which they had fattened with their blood, and to die a second death at the reaping of the corn. Now the ghosts of those who have perished by violence are surly, and apt to wreak their vengeance on their slayers whenever an opportunity offers. Hence the attempt to appease the souls of the slaughtered victims would naturally blend, at least in the popular conception, with the attempt to pacify the slain corn spirit. And as the dead came back in the sprouting corn, so they might be thought to return in the spring flowers, waked from their long sleep by the soft vernal airs. They had been laid to their rest under the sod. What more natural than to imagine that the violets and the hyacinths, the roses and the anemones, sprang from their dust, were empurpled or incarnadined by their blood, and contained some portion of their spirit? I sometimes think that never blows so red the rose as where some buried Caesar bled, that every hyacinth the garden wears dropped in her lap from some once lovely head. And this reviving herb, whose tender green fledges the river lip on which we lean, ah, lean upon it lightly, for who knows from what once lovely lip it springs unseen? In the summer after the battle of Landen, the most sanguinary battle of the 17th century in Europe, the earth, saturated with the blood of 20,000 slain, broke forth into millions of poppies, and the traveller who passed that vast sheet of scarlet might well fancy that the earth had indeed given up her dead. At Athens a great commemoration of the dead fell in spring, about the middle of March, when the early flowers are in bloom. Then the dead were believed to rise from their graves and go about the streets, vainly endeavouring to enter the temples and dwellings, which were barred against these perturbed spirits with ropes, buckthorn, and pitch. The name of the festival, according to the most obvious and natural interpretation, means the Festival of Flowers, and the title would fit well with the substance of the ceremonies if at that season the poor ghosts were indeed thought to creep from the narrow house with the opening flowers. There may therefore be a measure of truth in the theory of Renan, who saw in the Adonis worship a dreamy voluptuous cult of death, conceived not as the king of terrors, but as an insidious enchanter who lures his victim to himself and lulls them into an eternal sleep. The infinite charm of nature in the Lebanon, he thought, lends itself to religious emotions of this sensuous, visionary sort, hovering vaguely between pain and pleasure, between slumber and tears. It would doubtless be a mistake to attribute to Syrian peasants the worship of a conception so purely abstract as that of death in general. Yet it may be true that in their simple minds the thought of the reviving spirit of vegetation was blent with the very concrete notion of the ghosts of the dead, who come to life again in spring days with the early flowers, with the tender green of the corn and the many tinted blossoms of the trees. Thus their views of the death and resurrection of nature would be coloured by their views of the death and resurrection of man, by their personal sorrows and hopes and fears. In like manner we cannot doubt that Renan's theory of Adonis was itself deeply tinged by passionate memories, memories of the slumber akin to death which sealed his own eyes on the slopes of the Lebanon, memories of the sister who sleeps in the land of Adonis, never again to wake with the anemones and the roses. Chapter 33. The Gardens of Adonis. Perhaps the best proof that Adonis was a deity of vegetation, and especially of the corn, is furnished by